Hello again folks, and welcome to another screencast. And this particular screencast is looking at the Olympic Games as part of the Sport and Society element of OCR A-Level PE. Before we start on the Olympic Games and the modern Olympic Games, we need to talk about the ancient Olympic Games. And in the exam questions, you will always get a mark by stating that the Olympic Games were initially related to the ancient Olympic Games, but they are a separate entity. So it is important that you have a brief understanding of this, but we don't need to go into too much detail. The ancient Olympic Games were originally held in Greece, and as I mentioned, they were known as the ancient Olympic Games. So when you put your exam answer here, you'll be basing the modern Olympic Games could be related or based on the ancient Olympic Games is the statement that you would make. They ran around the 8th century and continued for a vast amount of time. And the primary purpose for the ancient Olympic Games was related to religious festivals, as well as exploring the idea of how they could improve the military or improve combat for the average person in Greece in case they went to war. So again, this is just a brief outline of those ancient Olympic Games, of what these Olympic traditions we see now are primarily based upon. In Britain, we had lots of festivals which brought together lots of different activities and became sort of alternative origins of the Olympic Games, if you like. We had two main festivals, one of which was called the Cotswold Games in the 1600s. You can see an image of the Cotswold Games here on the screen. In the Cotswold Games, we had lots of different activities that were around at the time. Bear in mind, this is pre-industrial Britain, so the activities reflected that. So you had some basic combat sports, you had wrestling, you had horse racing, you had coursing with hounds, you had jumping, you had fighting games. So these sort of games that were often played on an occasional basis in pre-industrial Britain would have been brought together to have one big festival to play those games, called the Cotswold Games. In the 1800s, this moved on. Around about the mid-1800s, we had an event or a festival called the Wenlock Games. And this was developed by someone called Dr. William Penny Brooks. And his games focused on the amateur ethos of things. So again, thinking about the time frame, we're looking at this idea of amateurism was developing in this time frame, the middle class. And so these games reflected athletics and other country sport pursuits such as quoits, football, cricket, even cycling on a penny farthing would have been competed for, but in an amateur spirit, so the ethos of the game, so reflecting civilised society. The development of the modern Olympic Games mainly came about by this individual from France called Baron Pierre de Coubertin. He was a French educator and historian, and what he did was he went to England in this time frame and he visited the Wenlock Games. So he met with Dr. William Penny Brooks in the mid-1800s, and he really liked what he saw. He liked the amateur ethos of the middle class, playing for the spirit of the game, the ethos and the fairness and the civilising qualities of it all. He also went to rugby school and he visited what was going on in the public schools at the time. So again, if you remember this athleticism cult that occurred in the third stage of the public schools to do with values of sport and learning values through the promotion of sport, he really liked that idea. So the combination of amateur Wenlock Games and the idea of the amateurism in British society, as well as learning values about sport, really promoted this idea that sports festivals could really be quite powerful in building society. It inspired de Coubertin to develop the first Olympics, which was held in Athens in 1896 and consisted of many games that were popular or activities that were popular at the time. When you're asked about the Olympics, you're sometimes asked in the exam questions about the aims and the philosophy of the modern Olympics. So remember, we're not talking about the Greek Olympics anymore, they're the ancient Olympics. We're talking about the modern Olympic philosophy. Baron Pierre de Coubertin's Olympics aimed to do the following things. Firstly, promote physical and moral qualities that are the basis of sport. So we talked about the idea of amateurism and values. He wanted to promote that. He wanted to educate people through sport, so helping people. He believed sport was this powerful mechanism to do that. He wanted to bring together the best athletes in the world every 4 years. So we wanted to bring people together every 4 years. And therefore, by doing this, he wanted to spread international goodwill throughout the world. Now, if you noticed, I've highlighted the first letter of each of those phrases. And the way we remember the aims or the philosophy is through the acronym PETS. So that's a nice simple way to remember those aims, those 4 aims of the modern Olympic philosophy if you're asked that question. Added to this, the exam questions might also ask you about the Olympic values. And so we have 10 of these which are on the screen. You will need to note down each of the 10 values. Other aspects of exam questions that are related to the Olympics talk about the 2 major governing bodies that are concerned with dealing with the Olympics. So we'll deal with these 2 one by one. The first one you need to understand something about is the British Olympic Association. In the exam they call that the BOA. So if you see that anywhere, that's the British Olympic Association. This was formed in 1905, so just after the first Olympics in 1896, and the main function of the British Olympic Association is to provide delegates for the National Olympic Committee. So we'd send 2 delegates from Britain, perhaps, to the National Olympic Committee, and they would speak on British people's behalf as to how the Olympics should fare or what elements are decided in that committee. The BOA is responsible for planning Team GB's participation in the Games. They don't provide coaching, they plan everything, so they are organisers. That's a very important distinction to make, because that is often the confusion when people write the answers to these exam questions. They are organisers. And so they also manage any funding that comes into the Team GB stream, which is mainly from the lottery. So they will manage that lottery funding. Key word there, manage, very important. The BOA also has several other roles. It picks the Team GB competitors. It doesn't coach them, but it selects them. So that's quite important. It prepares those athletes for the forthcoming games. Again, it doesn't coach them. It prepares them. So it puts in place a structure or a timetable those athletes can work to, or puts together a group of coaches but doesn't actually deliver the coaching. So it's instructing them. It delivers any form of support to the athletes during an Olympic cycle. So that might be through funding support, or guidance, or administration support. Remember, these people are organisers. It's responsible for developing the Olympic movement in the UK and educating the British public about the Olympics, particularly for schools and colleges and any form of educational establishment to promote it. As I mentioned previously, the BOA is mainly funded through lottery funding. It is not funded by the government, and it is not controlled by the government in any way. It's a separate entity. And therefore, it's completely dependent upon any income through sponsorship it can gain other than the lottery. The other major governing body that you need to have some awareness of is what we call the IOC, the International Olympic Committee. This was developed in Paris in 1894, just prior to the first Olympic Games in 1896. These individuals own the rights to the Olympic symbol. So wherever that symbol is promoted, they own the rights to use that symbol and those logos, as well as anything in relation to the games themselves. Again, like the BOA, they administer the Olympic movement, so they are organisers. As we said before, each independent national governing body, such as the British Olympic Association, would send delegates to the IOC. And the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, are responsible for selecting the host city. Please make a note there, it's not the host country, it's the host city that gets selected. The members also discuss what should be selected in terms of games for the competition. So they also select games. For example, in Rio, golf was introduced and rugby sevens. So they select these games based on what the delegates of the IOC discuss. And finally, they are also interconnected with the commercialisation of the games. They run the management of the major sponsors that they can attract. So for example, Coca-Cola is a good example. They would manage Coca-Cola's funding stream through the Olympic Games. The syllabus also ensures that you have some understanding of the Paralympic Games, because the two things run concurrently and are very important in relationship to each other. The Paralympic Games originally started as a competition for ex-servicemen who had come back from World War II, and some of these individuals were badly injured in the war, and in Stoke Mandeville they decided that they should have a competition to lift spirits and also to promote health and well-being for these veterans in particular activities at the time. The idea of a festival surrounding disabled athletes was mirrored in Rome in 1960, and they developed their own format with disabled athletes and giving them some physical and mental well-being through this. In 1976 in Toronto, disabled games were then added as a bolt-on almost to the main Olympics. So there were some disabled games added to this great Olympic spectacle. And then this was developed further in 1976 in Sweden, where they had the first Winter Paralympic Games held. Again, like the main Olympics, you'll need to understand some of the values that are associated with the Olympics, and there are 5 of these for your exams. So could you please make a note of these that are on the screen? Most of these are very, very similar to the main Olympics, and so therefore when you're revising them, you should only need to revise them once for both Olympic aspects. Finally, in this screencast, it's important to note that the Olympic Games are often a reflection of society at its present time. And in particular Olympic Games, there have been groups that have tried to exploit the Olympic Games for political purposes. So there's been some form of political agenda which they believed in, and they've tried to use their opportunity, as they're being watched by millions and millions around the world, to exploit this. And so we say they use it as a vehicle to make a political point. And the games that did this really, really effectively, in terms of what happened in those games, are the 5 games as follows: Berlin in 1936, Mexico City in 1968, Munich in 1972, Moscow in 1980, and Los Angeles in 1984. And these games are on your syllabus to understand as case studies as to what happened politically in relation to those 5 Olympic events. And a task will be set for you with regards to this. Okay, once again, thanks for watching this screencast. As always, if you need any more help with any of the Sport and Society modules or any other aspects of OCR A-Level PE, please head over to the iSpeakpe channel on YouTube.